now. And then let's just check it's recording. Okay, it's recording, so we can just start one on.
Fab.
Hello everyone, thank you for watching our training webinar around understanding and responding to distress. My name is Izzy Hayter-Rogers and I'm a graduate mental health worker, or otherwise known as a resilience worker in the Resilience Project.
Hi, my name is Harriet Colley and I'm a clinical psychologist in Enfys, which is a service for children who are looked after.
As an overview for this training, so we've developed the training together with the Resilience Project and Enfys for education staff working with children and young people in Cardiff and the Vale of Glamorgan in South Wales. We split the training into 2 1-hour sessions, which you may wish to watch during an inset day or during a twilight session at your education school or setting. Throughout the training, there's different opportunities to pause and reflect either by yourself or with your team about how the information and strategies we're discussing can be implemented and applied in your education setting. In the comments section of this YouTube video, there's a link to evaluate the training. We'd really appreciate your feedback as we're a new service and we just really value your input in our training. So I'll just briefly give an overview of both of our teams. So both of the Resilience Project and Enfys work in a really similar way. We work in this pyramid model that you can see here. So we both offer universal support, as you can see at the bottom of that pyramid. So that means that we provide universal support in terms of training or resources. And then the next step up from that is targeted support. So we offer consultations for staff to think about specific young people and their needs. And then we both offer group work as well. So the Resilience Project offers this to children and young people, and then the Enfys offers this to adults. Is that correct, Harriet?
That is correct, yes. So foster carers and social workers mainly.
Brilliant. And then we both offer direct interventions at the top of that pyramid there. So that's with children and young people and their families directly then. Where the teams differ is that Enfys is a Cardiff and Vale health board service for children who are looked after, and the Resilience Project is a project created by the Health Board, the Mental Health Foundation, the charity, and education services. We work more broadly to support schools around the children that they have concerns about or that don't fit easily into existing services within the healthcare system. As an overview of the training, so like I said, it's a 2-part series. The aim of part 1 of this webinar is to build on our knowledge and understanding of distress. So what might result in a child or young person experiencing distress and what their distress might look like. So to do this, we're going to focus on trauma and adverse experiences, impact of trauma on brain development, recognizing distress using what's called the window of tolerance, looking at the difference between guilt and shame, and understanding what triggers and challenges there might be in education settings. Then in part 2, we're going to move on to the skills that we can use to help the child when they're in distress. We're going to do this by covering whole class approaches, individual approach. We're going to look at the 3 R's of responding to distress, the 2 hands approach, and then we're going to apply that to a case study. And then we're going to show you some more resources that you might find useful. So for now, I think Harriet's going to start with what impacts on distress.
Yes, thank you, Izzy. So yeah, we're going to have a start by thinking about what impacts distress. So what kind of things might cause the children and young people that we see at school to be feeling distressed? So we're just going to have a little pause here for a minute, and feel free to pause the video if you need longer than a minute, just to have a think about some examples of traumatic experiences that could cause distress to some children and young people. So either write things down if you'd like to, or have a chat with the people that you're watching this webinar with, and we'll just give you a minute or so just to have a chance to reflect on that.
that okay, Harriet?
Yeah. So thank you. I hope that was helpful. So when we're talking about trauma, what we're talking about is the psychological response to an event rather than the physical event itself. So different people will have different psychological responses to different events. So there's some examples of traumatic experiences here that you can see that might cause distress. So for example, think about unpredictable or inconsistent caregiving. For example, there might be a child whose mum has depression, and some days when she's feeling better and her mood is a bit lifted, she might be really in tune with her child. She might be able to be really nurturing and loving and meet their needs consistently. And then on other days, if she's having a really difficult time and she's feeling really down, then it might be that she really struggles to meet the child's needs. So she might become more withdrawn or be more absent. And what this means is that the child learns that mum's not always available, that sometimes they can rely on her and sometimes they can't, which for a little baby or a little child that needs an adult to keep themselves safe, this is really scary and can be really distressing. It's really unsettling to be in an environment which is unpredictable. And if this happens repeatedly over a long period of time, it can be quite traumatizing and distressing for a child. And then another example we've got here is witnessing violence in the family home. So if a little child is witnessing mum hitting dad or vice versa, they're bound to feel scared and unsafe in the home. Additionally, if mum and dad are unlikely to be consistently able to parent the child because they are too busy keeping themselves safe from a potentially violent partner, and so they're unable to meet the needs of the children because they're too busy dealing with whatever else they've got going on. And so throughout this presentation, we might use the term developmental trauma in future slides. And this is just an umbrella term for all of these traumatizing events that happen early on in life, early in a child's development. That's why we call it developmental trauma. So we just wanted to flash up here the ACEs, which I'm sure you're already aware of, a lot of you, of this research that's been done by Public Health Wales. So we've just put it here to highlight how common these events are and to note that trauma is something that sadly isn't rare. It's not necessarily something that's not very common. It's something that we need to be aware of for everybody. And if we have a look at the impact of ACEs, you can see that these early experiences that young people have, these ACEs or developmental trauma, have really long-lasting impacts as these children grow up into adulthood. So for example, people who have experienced ACEs or developmental trauma are 6 times more likely to have received treatment for a mental health difficulty, and they're 9.5 times more likely to be feeling suicidal or to have self-harmed in adulthood. So these are things we need to be really aware of, and are things that we can make a big impact on when the kids are little. In early life, to try and reduce these long-lasting impacts. So that's why it's so important that we act now, which is why, you know, they spend most of their time at school, and this is why we're delivering this training to you guys, because you can have such a powerful influence over some of these experiences for young people.
This is a model that's used to show how we can be influenced and impacted across lots of different systems within our environment. So there's different levels that you can see here. And we can use this model to think about what aspects of the environment might cause a child or young person to feel distress, as well as the aspects that might safeguard and protect them from that distress. So to go through this model, we have that individual level that you can see on the centre on the left. So an influencing factor of distress on this level might be that a child was born with a health condition that required a long period of time in hospital, for example. So it's that health aspect. Stepping out from there, we've got the microsystem. So that refers to the people closest to us in our day-to-day life. And here we can see that school staff are directly working with a child or young person are just as influential as that immediate family. So having a teacher that they feel safe and supported by is a great protective factor against this stress at this level. And then we have that mesosystem on the next level. So that's the influence of the closest people on each other. So for example, the relationship between parents and school staff. So if that relationship is really strong, that's another protective factor against distress. And then there's the exosystem further out. So that's the people that are around us, but that we might not directly engage with on a day-to-day level. So for example, a child might live in a neighborhood where there's violence and aggression around them. And so it's important to recognize that that is a distress and influence. And then there's the macro system further out. So that's the wider cultural and social influences. So that recognises the impact of poverty, racism, homophobia, and other traumatic events that can occur within communities. And then again, further out from that, we've got the corona system. So that's about life events or transitions. So that's the impact of coronavirus, the impact of transitioning to different schools or moving homes. And so what we can see from this model is that someone's distress is often a really complex interaction of all these various influences on different levels.
So we just wanted to touch on this really, to think about overlap and misdiagnosis between developmental trauma and some of these diagnoses that you might see in the young people that you have in your school. So when children are exposed to developmental trauma, the threat part of their brain overdevelops and the social part of their brain underdevelops. This is because they've grown up in a threatening environment where they've had to be hyper alert to their surroundings in order to keep themselves safe. So for example, if you think about that example we gave earlier about a child who's grown up witnessing domestic violence, there's that constant feeling of being in a threatening environment, and so that threat part of their brain overdevelops. And at the same time, they've also been in environments where the people around them have not been able to meet their needs. And so they learn that other people can't be relied upon. In fact, other people might be a bit scary. As a result, the social part of their brain doesn't develop in the same way as it would for a child who's not experienced developmental trauma, because those social relationships aren't giving them as much as they would need, or as much as a child who would have if they've not experienced developmental trauma. So the overdevelopment of the threat part of their brain means that these children are often hyper alert to their surroundings. They spend a lot of time in their fight-flight response. And this might look like ADHD or any of these other disorders listed above, where the child's behaviour is due to a fight-flight response. So it might be, for example, that they're constantly hyper alert, they're constantly looking at their surroundings, so they find it really hard to stay in their seat for a long time. So it might be that they feel quite hyperactive. Or it might be that because they're in fight mode all the time, that you see some of these conduct disorders or the oppositional defiant disorder that you've got above. And similarly, the underdevelopment of the social part of the brain means that these children find social relationships really difficult. And so they might display behaviours that look similar to autism, to ASD. It might be that they don't want to form relationships. It might be that they have a really hard time playing with other kids because they're not used to social relationships. So we just wanted to raise this really, not to say that ADHD or autism don't exist. They absolutely do exist in their own right, but just to be wary, I guess, of what kind of overlap there might be with developmental trauma, and to kind of keep that in mind so that we're making sure that we're meeting the needs of these children the best way that we can. So we've got a little video here which talks about how trauma impacts on children's brain development. So whilst you're watching the video, maybe think of a child that you know that's been through some of these adverse experiences and have a think about what might be happening in their brain.
The brain develops from the bottom up. The first thing to develop is the brainstem, or the reptilian brain as some people might call it. This area is responsible for our bodily functions. It tells us when to regulate our temperature, when to sleep, and when to eat. The next important part of our brains to develop is the limbic system, or what some people might call the mammalian part of the brain. The limbic system supports a variety of functions including emotion, behaviour, motivation, and long-term memory. The next part of the brain to develop is the cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain. This is sometimes considered the human part because humans are one of the only mammals that develop this part of the brain. This part of the brain is responsible for how we as humans were able to develop language, have thoughts, self-awareness, perception, and consciousness. Also, the cortex plays a key role in integrating the central nervous system and functions of memory. The last and most advanced part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is considered the executive functioning part of the brain. For some people, this part doesn't fully develop until they're in their mid to late 20s. The prefrontal cortex helps us to think through cause and effect, the ability to plan for the future, set goals, and understand the consequences of our actions. It's also responsible for the ability to moderate social behaviour. When we're in a stressful situation, part of our limbic system called the amygdala sets off an alarm bell response to let us know we're in danger and we need to do something about it. When this happens, the brain floods with a hormone called cortisol, so the body knows that something needs to be done. The most common responses to a stressful or dangerous situation are some you might be familiar with: fight, flight, freeze, or submit. This is an inbuilt system of survival to keep us safe when we're in danger. Like when our ancestors might have had to decide whether to stand their ground and fight against a large predator or run away. A stress response is a healthy, normal part of being a human. It lets us know that our bodies are working and keeping us safe. If a person is exposed to a highly stressful or traumatic event, or they have continual exposure to stressful events like abuse or neglect, their alarm system might become overactive. It might be always switched on, as if there was a risk of danger or threat at all times. For a child, this might affect how their brain develops. This is especially the case if it's in the context of stress or trauma events by a primary caregiver. In these cases, the child might develop an understanding of the world as an unsafe and dangerous place, even when they are in a safe situation. Sometimes this is called hypervigilance. It means being on edge or aware of danger at all times. Being exposed to stressful and traumatic events on a regular basis can also have a significant impact on neural connections in the memory center. It can even change the way we remember actual events.
Oh. So yeah, like the video said, interruptions in brain development can occur for a range of reasons. For example, trauma, like abuse or neglect, as well as physical health problems. So chronically traumatized children are often stuck in their brainstem and limbic system. And they've not been in an environment that has allowed the development of the cortical part of their brain, the bit that develops third. And now they're using up all of their resources trying to stay safe and work out whether adults can be trusted or not, which leaves little resources for the higher brain skills, which are needed for good cognitive functioning. So this cortical bit, the blue bit you can see in that diagram, is the bit where all the emotion regulation, cognitive skills, reasoning, etc. happens. It's the bit that makes us human, I guess. So it's the thinking, learning, inhibiting our responses. And children who have experienced developmental trauma are therefore likely to struggle with cognitive skills. For example, they might, the child's ability to do things like plan ahead, problem solve, organise themselves, or learn from their mistakes are often less well developed. They're also likely to struggle with regulating their emotions and with reasoning. So that third bit of their brain, the cortical bit of their brain, is less well developed than it is in children that haven't experienced developmental trauma. And as a result, their brain's ability to regulate emotions can often resemble that of a child much younger in chronological age. So we often refer to these ages as chronological age, in other words, the child's age in years, and the developmental age, in other words, the stage that the child is at developmentally. And this helps us to understand why some children are often described as naughty or attention seeking, because to others it looks as though they're displaying toddler-like behaviour, when actually they are just displaying behaviours that match their developmental age rather than their chronological age. So not all children react to things in the same way, and we've learned to react to things in certain ways because of our experiences, which means that certain pathways in our brain become stronger and more automatic than others because of our experiences. So the phrases, I think, I might get this wrong now, things that wire to, oh no, I can't remember all the phrases.
Things that fire together, wire together. Is that what you're saying?
Thanks, Izzy. Yes, things that fire together, wire together. So the more that, what that phrase means, if I can get it right, is the more that we have these experiences repeated, the stronger these kind of neural networks become. But that doesn't mean that things are necessarily set in stone. So new networks and new pathways can be created by helping children interact in different ways. And something called synaptic pruning occurs when the brain eliminates these unused synapses or connections. And this means there's a key opportunity for us to create changes in children and young people's brain development. And there's two key phases of this synaptic pruning happening in the brain. One is kind of before the age of 4, there's lots of synaptic pruning happening, and then again this happens again in adolescence. So those are kind of two key phases where there's lots and lots of pruning going on. So you can see this example above. So here, this person is practicing yoga and meditation and has built new networks and pathways in their brain. So when a car cuts in front of them in the past, they might have experienced road rage and shouted and screamed at this car. You know, I've definitely been there before, but now they have learned the ability to take a deep breath, count to 10, and maybe think to themselves, does this really affect me? So because of their practicing of yoga and meditation and that building up of new networks and pathways, they've learned new ways to react to situations. So I guess the key message here is just to finish on a note that we can help these children. It's just that it takes a lot of time and patience.
So yeah, now we've had a bit more of an understanding of why children might become distressed. Now we're going to have a look at what distress looks like and how we might know when a child is in distress. So just to have a pause there for a few minutes, either by yourself or with others, have a think about what distress looks like in children and young people. What behaviours might we notice, or what signs might we look out for, especially in education settings? So I think we'll carry on now, but if you do need more time, please just pause the video, come back to it when you're ready. So if you're thinking about what distress looks like, so for children who've experienced or are even still experiencing trauma, their body's going to be in a near constant state of distress, where they're living in that survival mode constantly. Their body's going to be doing everything it can to look out for danger and always be prepared to stop it or get away from it. So these are some examples of the behaviours that we might see from a child or young person who is in that survival mode. The brain video that we saw earlier, that brain development video, it briefly mentioned being hypervigilant. So this is where someone's on high alert, they're scanning, looking out for danger. A child might always sit with their back against the wall so that they can view and scan the room. They might intensely watch people who enter the classroom or moving around the classroom. They might keep their bag and coat on so that they're ready if they need to leave suddenly. And their body is going to be pumped with adrenaline, so it's prepared to get away from danger at any moment. It's not relaxing, it's sitting up ready and waiting so that it can get away if it needs to. So they're going to be in that high energy state with all that adrenaline. They're going to be tapping, fidgeting, moving around the room. Or again, after that adrenaline's left their body, they're going to crash. They might be sleeping on the desk, really absolutely shattered and exhausted. They might feel like they're starting to get overwhelmed by their brain is picking up on the noises, lights and things in their environment that's happening around them. And they might try to shut off from this. They might be feeling too overwhelmed and overloaded. So they might cover their eyes, ears, have their hood up, have their head on the desk, for example. Also, as a result of traumatic events, some children and young people might go into what we can call a dissociative state. So that's where their mind feels overwhelmed, and to protect itself, it automatically shuts off from what is happening around them. So they might look like they've suddenly just started staring into space, and when they come back, they can't really remember what's just happened or where they are, and feel dissociated from the environment that they're in. And we can also see for some children and young people that their distress is apparent in the relationships or the way that they relate to others. Some children learn to survive by clinging on to anybody that they might have that relationship with. So they might not leave their side. They might always want to sit near them, might hold the teacher that they're with, always want to be at the front of the class, for example. That person to them might be their only form of protection. On the other hand, they might feel over-responsible to protect that person, so always feel like they need to be with them just in case something happens so that they can protect them. Some children learn to survive by not relying on others, so they might have learned that other people are dangerous to them, so they've learned that they need to try and get on by themselves. And so they might always be withdrawn, or they might try and hide away from others, or not really want to rely on anyone, prefer to do the things by themselves. Often children do a mixture of both of these things with different people or in different environments. They're trying to learn what is the safest thing to do right now. And all of these different things, these different ways of interacting, can make relationship building really difficult for a lot of children and young people. A good way to sort of bring together these different types of distress responses is to use this ladder model by Stephen Porges. So it's based on the idea that our distress looks different depending on whether we're engaged in that fight or flight response or in a freeze or submit response. And so at the top of this ladder, you can see here, this person at the top, that's where we'll be when we feel safe, calm, socially engaged. So it's where we find it easier to learn and to connect with people. For those children that haven't experienced developmental trauma, they're going to be at the top of the ladder for the majority of the time. And then we can see at the middle steps, that's where a child might be if they're in fight or flight. So they're stressed, anxious, the world seems dangerous, chaotic, unfriendly, they're frantic, agitated, they're ready to mobilize, ready to act in case danger occurs. That's where they'll be, so they're feeling irritated and things around, they might think that other people are unfriendly and they're looking out for danger. And then we can see at the bottom of that ladder, that's where a child might be if they're in freeze or submit mode. So they're feeling overwhelmed, unable to fight the danger or get away from it, so they completely just shut off, might feel numb, disconnected. Like we can see, it says, I feel like I'm buried under a huge load and I can't get out. And so when we want to help children get back to the top of that ladder, that's the best place for them to be in order to learn and to engage with others around them. And we'll think back about how we can help for children and young people to regulate their distress and get back to that top level at the ladder in part 2 of this training. We've got another video here which looks at the different type of distress responses in what's called the window of tolerance.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to now think about making sense of distress and how and why a child might become distressed in school. So the first thing we're going to think about is the difference between shame and guilt. So for a child who whose experiences have been positive and maybe didn't experience the traumatic events we've mentioned, when something goes wrong, they know that they did something bad or that it was their behaviour that was the issue. And so they experience this feeling of guilt. They know it was the behaviour that was wrong. And that feeling of guilt is healthy. They feel bad about it, but they know that it was just the behaviour. It's not a reflection on who they are as a person. As opposed to shame, which is a close emotion, but when a child experiences shame, they think that it's a reflection on who they are rather than a reflection on what they did. So that little picture you've got there about I did something bad versus I am bad is the difference between guilt and shame. And the way that we develop guilt comes from shame. So as a child, when a young person or a child does something wrong, they experience this feeling of shame initially. So for example, if they pull the cat's tail and they get told off by their parent, you shouldn't do that, you've hurt the cat, the child naturally experiences shame and gets upset. At this point, parents who are available and are attuned to the child's needs will comfort the child and say, it's okay, I forgive you, I still love you. And this way the child learns guilt. I'm loved no matter what, but my behaviour was not acceptable. So children who haven't had this attuned relationship with their caregiver are often left with these feelings of shame. They've not had an adult who's there to kind of guide them into these feelings of guilt. And therefore these children internalise the shouting at them to mean something bad about them. I'm a bad person rather than I did a bad thing. So if they pull the cat's tail and they get shouted at by their caregiver, they think I'm a bad person, because the caregiver's not there to guide them into this feeling of it's okay, we all make mistakes, pulling the cat's tail is bad, but you are not bad. And so importantly, when these children are then told off again in future, these children that have never been guided into feeling guilt, it triggers these feelings of shame and it leads them to confirm their beliefs about themselves, that they are bad and that they're unlovable. And so this is important going into a school environment, thinking that these children are more likely to interpret any form of discipline or correction as shaming, and that they're likely to think I'm bad rather than feel guilty for their behaviour and think I did something bad. And that also means that they're less likely to learn from discipline or correction, because they don't understand that it's the behaviour that was wrong. They think that they are wrong as a person. And so feelings of shame are really, really intolerable. I can't remember if you can all think about I can't remember the last time I felt shame. I'm just wondering if you guys can think about the last time you felt shame or even just embarrassed. It's just the worst feeling. You just want the ground to swallow you up. It's really, really intolerable feeling. And so these children often respond with this shield of shame to prevent these feelings of shame from happening, to prevent other people from making them feel shame. And so they engage in these behaviours that you can see on this slide here. So they might deny it. I didn't pull the cat's tail. I don't know what you're on about. You didn't see that. Or they might blame it. Well, the cat scratched me first, so it's his fault that I pulled his tail. Or they might minimise it. Well, the cat didn't mind that I pulled his tail. He's absolutely fine. I only pulled it a little bit. Or they might go into full rage. You always blame me. You think everything's my fault. And so you might have a situation where a child, for example, hits someone in the classroom. And of course, as the teacher, you need to deal with that and address that behaviour. And what you might see from the child is any of these behaviours, and that's because their shield of shame has come up. Okay. Imagine you have children in your school who do these often, and I imagine that they're really, really tough behaviours to deal with. So we're going to go on to think about some strategies that are helpful when helping and supporting a child to experience shame. Izzy's going to talk about that a little bit later, so don't worry, we'll come on to talk about what to do with children who have their shield of shame up as well. But for now, we're just going to have another little pause and a moment to reflect and have a think about a child or young person you've been working with in the past where you might have seen that shield of shame, and how did they use these behaviours to protect themselves from feeling that shame.
Should we go on to the next one, Harriet?
Yeah. Okay, so the last concept we want to introduce you to today is this idea of something called the internal working model. So childhood trauma not only affects how children view themselves in terms of these feelings of shame, but it also impacts how they view other people around them, especially adults, and also how they view the world. And this is referred to as someone's internal working model, which is basically the idea that we all kind of have a template that we take with us around the world and in relationships with people that are based on our experiences of the world and relationships when we were younger. So this internal working model is kind of that template of how we now see the world. So for example, if you've grown up with adults who are loving and supportive and nurturing, you're likely to view the world similar to the picture on the right. That'd be a nice little world to live in, wouldn't it? You can trust them and you want to be close to them. The world feels safe and secure, and you know that you're loved, you're worthy, and you're a good person. Whereas if you've grown up with adults who are dangerous or unpredictable or inconsistent, you're likely to view the world as scary and think that everything's a potential threat. So you're much more like the picture we've got here on the left. And children with this internal working model are going to be less likely to trust adults, including their teachers or other school staff, because they haven't been able to trust adults early in life. And they view the world as unsafe. Adults can't be trusted, and I am bad. This internal process is completely unconscious. You know, children and ourselves aren't aware of all of this stuff that's going on inside. We're not aware of us taking this internal working model or this template into our future relationships. It's just an automatic, unconscious process. So just as a little demonstration to give you an example of how this internal working model works, I just want you to watch this video for a few seconds and notice how you're feeling when you're watching it. Okay, and now the same thing. Notice how you feel when you're watching this video. Okay, so I don't know about you, but I definitely felt much less wary of the world around me in the second video. I felt the music was quite calming, the view looked lovely, I didn't feel like I was going to be in any danger. Whereas in the first video, that music and the setting that I was in made me feel much, much more wary of what was about to happen. I was kind of expecting something to jump out of from behind one of the trees at any point. And this is a little bit like people's internal working model. So those of us who've grown up expecting things to be unsafe, then expect things to be unsafe in the future. So they have that scary music playing in the background all the time, as opposed to those who've grown up feeling safe and have that more kind of neutral, positive music playing in the background, and they expect the world to be safe. So you can imagine what it would feel like to be walking around and always having that kind of scary music playing and expecting something bad to happen. You're likely to kind of go into those survival states much more easily than if you're feeling safe in the world already. And that's what the internal working model is all about, really.
We're going to think about what everyday challenges or triggers might occur in school or education settings to push people out of that window of tolerance, to make people feel that distress. So children who have that view that the world is scary, you can't trust adults, they might find it hard, like we've said here, to do these things. So going into some of them, so they might find it hard to separate from their primary caregivers. You might see that morning handover, especially in primary schools, from the caregiver into the school. They might find that that's quite distressing. They might get really upset. They might not want to leave their caregiver. It's really important that we remember that we're asking a lot from them in those instances. We're asking them to leave the only person that they trust to keep them safe. And so that's where that distress comes from. For others, relinquishing control can be quite hard. So they might not listen to the instructions you're giving, or they might want to be the boss of their social group on the playground. Instead of viewing that as sort of manipulated behaviour, we can try and view it as a child that has come to understand through their experiences that other people aren't going to keep them safe, and it's up to them and only them to keep them safe. And in order to keep yourself safe, you have to be in control of what is happening and what the people around you are doing. And so that's why relinquishing control can be quite scary for some children, and why giving up that control can cause them to feel distressed. Another example is that repairing relationships can be quite hard. So this is things that can happen quite often in school. We might try and a kid might do something where you say, oh, you have to go and say sorry to this other child that you've just hit. And they might show that shield of shame. Then they might become really, really distressed if we try and get them to do that, or if we try and get them to admit that they've done something wrong. And it might not just be a case of, they've got bad manners or something like that. It's more that it goes back to that feeling of shame that Harriet spoke about. So they might really struggle to make those amends because it triggers feelings that they're bad, they're worthless, and nobody likes them. And so these are just some really everyday things that might happen in a school environment, but understanding that why they're causing that distress. So we've got some common triggers as well. So there's lots of things that can happen throughout the day. Naturally, they're going to occur in the school, but just be mindful of why they might cause children and young people who've experienced developmental trauma to become distressed. So change of plans can be particularly difficult. So supply teachers, room change, unexpected visitors. This all reminds them that they're not in control, which again means that they don't feel safe. Autobiographical activities such as getting to know you activities or family trees, or even sort of writing about an exciting experience that's happened over the Christmas break. That can be quite hard for some children because those environments or those times that you're trying to get them to think back to could be distressing or traumatic. And so that can push them into thinking that they're in those difficult times, which can understandably be really distressing. And then we've got praise. So praise can be quite difficult for some children. They might get angry at you if you say, oh, well done, that was really, really good. They might go, why are you saying that? And get really frustrated and annoyed at you. Or if you say, oh, I like your drawing, some children might rip that up or throw it away. And for those children who believe that they've got that internal working model that they're worthless, nobody likes them, they're not a good child, adults can't be trusted. If a teacher tells them that what they were doing was good, that doesn't fit with that idea of themselves, that core beliefs that they have about themselves and others. And so someone saying that they're a good person reminds them that they feel like they're a bad person. And so that's why that they can feel distressed through praise. And with this, we'd say that praise is really important to change those internal beliefs into more positive ones. But we can do it in a way that's manageable, so in smaller doses. And a way to do this is to focus on their behaviour rather than them as a person. So, for example, oh, what if they're playing football? Oh, wow, I love that goal you just made. That was such a good goal. Rather than, oh, wow, you're an amazing footballer, aren't you? So that's a bit more easier to take and easier to assimilate into their idea of themselves. And these challenges and triggers, they're going to be different for every child because it's based on their experiences. We might not always know what they are, but if we can sort of anticipate what might trigger some children and young people to feel distressed, we'll have that hindsight to be able to put more support in place before that distress occurs. and understand their distress responses if they do occur. So if you have some time, please again pause here to have a think about whether you've noticed or have these triggers or challenges occurring through your everyday school or education setting, and what distress behaviours you've seen in response to those. So thank you everyone for listening. This was part 1 of our Understanding and Responding to Distress webinar. If you have any questions, please do message us to ask. And please go on to part 2 when you're ready. Is that okay, Harriet?
Yeah, wonderful. We did it.
We did it.